Hi, my name is Elizabeth Hernandez. I want to go over chapter 6 in ethics called The Purpose of Criminal Punishment. In this chapter, we'll go over punishment, and a society has the right to punish and inflict pain while being morally justifiable. Let's see. To better understand this nature of punishment, we have to examine the concept of basis and consider theories which will be deterrence, retribution, justice deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, and restorative justice, as well as three perspectives, which is punishment, sociological, criminological, and philosophical. Each represent a different issue of punishment. Well, what is punishment? Punishment is used to describe anything that is painful or to impose a way to correct the behavior. Kind of like when you're a kid and you do something wrong, so a teacher gives you punishment, right? That's like that. There are 5 different elements that are imposed as a sanction for criminal offense, which are 1. It must involve an unpleasantness to the victim. 2. It must be for an offense, actual or supposed. It must be of an offender, actual or supposed. 4. It must be the work of personal agencies. In other words, it must not be the natural consequence of an action. 5. It must be imposed by an authority or institution against whose rules the offense has been committed. If this is not the case, then the act is not a punishment, but is simply a hostile act. Similarly, direct action by a person who has no special authority and is not property called punishment and is more likely to be revenge or an act of hostility. Let's go over deterrence. Deterrence is an action of discouraging an action through instilling fear of consequences. So in ethics, it's hard to determine whether the kind of penalty of severity has any effect on whether a penalty is successful. Utilitarian punishment can be justified if the harm that it prevents is greater than harm inflicted to the offender through punishing him or her. Hudson, 1996. Let's go over punishment in history and called draconian punishments. So Draco was punishment of death. Their punishments were so severe that it made people think twice into committing crimes. Let's go over a case study. Study 6.1, the nature of punishment, corporal punishment. On May 4, 1984, Michael Fay, a U.S. teenager who had pleaded guilty to several acts of vandalism in Singapore, was caned by Singapore authorities. He was stripped, bent to the hip over a padded trestle, tied down at his ankles and wrists, and his buttocks were lashed by martial arts specialists 4 times. With 4-foot-long, half-inch white stick of a random-soaked antiseptic. Fay, 18, had lived in Singapore since 1992. He was sentenced to 4 months in prison and a fine of $2,000, and the caning after his guilty plea. The U.S. stepped in and appealed Singapore, stating that clemency would have been an enlightened decision. However, many believed that this was a good idea. People here in Fay's father, who lived here in Ohio, supported the punishment, saying that it was a 2-1 margin. Singapore's courts and government rejected the various appeals of clemency, except for reducing the number of lashes. Singapore was able to keep the society orderly and crime-free because of its tough laws against antisocial crimes. That Singapore did not have a situation like that in New York, whereas vandalism were commonplace and where even police cars were vandalized. So Singapore has a society that doing these crimes, people deter from criminal acts, and more like a crime-free area, as in the U.S. and their policies are different. You do this, you vandalize this, you don't like get like a hit on the wrist. People don't really give you anything for what you have done. They just look away and you keep going with your life. But what does that do in an ongoing life? You keep doing the same thing over and over again and you won't get caught. So it doesn't make it justifiable. Let's go over utilitarian theories. Individuals and general deterrence. Individual deterrence involves deterring someone who has already offended from reoffending, and general deterrence involves dissuading potential offenders from offending all the way of the punishment administered for a particular offense. Retribution. Retribution is the theory that punishment is justified because it is deserved. You deserve to get treated like this because of what you did. Sort of like an eye for an eye from Lex Talionis, which is the punishment should inflict the same for offenders that have inflicted on their victims. Instead of it's a limit in nature of retribution and prevented excessive penalties or vengeance. So let's say you commit a crime, which is rape. What an eye for an eye is, you're gonna get raped back. That's what Lex Talionis thought that it was back then. But now, an eye for an eye is you have to look over to see, hey, you raped this person, but we can't do the same thing to you because it's not of nature. Justifying retributions. Offenders who are offended are paying their debt to society, while their victims does not feel like it's compensating for their acts at all. So do you think it's a justifying retribution? Someone commits a crime towards you, and all they have to do is just sit in a cell and pay their debt to society, while you feel like they committed a crime against you, and you feel like, okay, what about me? What happens to me? Can I get revenge? Can I get the same thing as what they're doing? It's like something happened to me, but now they're in a cell, right? That's what's justifying retribution is. Just deserts. Offenders deserve to be punished because they violated the laws and it's normally permissible to punish. Ranking crimes for seriousness. Who determines and what degree of seriousness? In California, it's the politicians and others who raise tariffs for offenses in responses to public or media pressure to give off onto crime. So who determines what degree of seriousness does a person have for punishment, which is politicians and people who vote for these offenses. Retribution and remorse. If the sentence is utilitarian, he or she will be concerned only about whether a remorseful offender will be less likely to be reoffended. In other, be remorseful will make you seem guilty and have culpability. Mixed retributivism, which argues for punishment is an institution to be justified as utilitarian grounds, whereas actual implementations is justified on retributive grounds. Punishment is not to inflict pain, but to meet a demand for justice for those who have misused freedom in which it follows. The punishment and sentence must be properly authorized. The offense must be sufficiently grave to the society's aggrieved that the well-being of the community is affected adversely. The motivation for punishment must be justice, not vengeance. Punishments must be associated with discrimination based on gender, race, religion, or class. Punishments must express cherished values and be aimed at restoring peace and harmony, and even restitution for injured parties. Punishment should not be cruel and should not be a least harsh sentence and aimed to restore offenders to the rightful place within their moral community. Punishment should be at least the last resort after every effort has been made to restore relations between them, offender and the victim. The restitution, restorative justice, and alternative punishments to incarceration should be considered rather than a focus solely on imprisonment. Punishment should restore a value equilibrium distorted and distributed by wrongdoing. And finally, punishment policies should observe the principle of proportionality in a social sense and should recognize that not all the persons in society enjoy equal opportunities. The punishment should be therefore be capable of mitigation based on social injustice and offenders' personal circumstances. Rehabilitation. Let's go over effective rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is when punishment should aim to reform the offender and assist in their transition from criminal to a law abiding citizen. It is only successful when criminals come to reject crime of choice, meaning when they have an option to choose crime and they choose not to. That's when you know that it was effective and you have been processed through the rehabilitation. Why punish? The sociological approach. In Marxist perspectives, punishments and the value of labor. Punishments is an exchange for transaction in which the offender pays his debt to society. That's Marxist perspective. Foucault, power and discipline. For Foucault, punishment is producing right thinking citizen that is now trained on a disciplined individual. To conclude, in the end, there is no single approach that we can all agree that justification is for punishment, and we can only gain perspectives by combing through philosophical, sociological, and criminological approaches. So there is no right and wrong answer into what how far a punishment can go. That is all. Thank you.